Hello, everyone. Today we are going to study a wonderful chapter in the Bible, Judges chapter 4. This, of course, is the chapter of Deborah and Barak and their battle against Sisera and Yavin, the last remnants of the Canaanites that remained in the land of Israel after the original conquests in the book of Joshua and a bit in the beginning of the book of Judges. I would like to just focus on a few elements here, particularly to get a better understanding of who exactly was Yael. Yael turns out to be the main hero of this story, in my opinion. But let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the very beginning of the chapter. Chapter 4, verse 1, we learn about how the nation of Israel sins and does bad, and we see this is an ongoing type of cycle in the book of Judges where the nation sins, God sends an oppressor, they then turn to God, and then God sends a redeemer, usually a judge or someone who is called a judge. Anyway, in this case, we hear that they are being oppressed by Yavin, the king of Canaan. Let's read this very carefully, this bit of scripture that explains who he is. Yavin, the king of Canaan, who ruled in Chatzor, and his chief of staff, Sisera, and he dwells in Charoshet Hagoyim. Okay, so first of all, a few very interesting things. We learned previously in the book of Joshua chapter 11, that Joshua actually, as part of the battle against the Northern Coalition, and in fact the leader of the Northern Coalition who tried to defeat Joshua and the nation of Israel and of course failed, the leader of that coalition was Yavin, the king of Chatzor. And we learned in Joshua chapter 11 that Joshua defeated them completely. There was no remnant, and in fact totally burnt down and destroyed the city of Chatzor. So here we have again Yavin, and we learned that he is the king of Canaan, but he ruled in Chatzor. So first of all, you might think this contradicts Joshua 11, because in Joshua 11 it says very specifically that Joshua killed Yavin, the king of Chatzor. So one of the commentaries that I've seen that I think makes a lot of sense here is that Yavin, like Pharaoh, is not a name of an individual person, but is a name that was used by a particular dynasty or a particular, or not necessarily like Pharaoh was really a name that was used by any king in ancient times of Egypt. In the case of Yavin, it may be like Pharaoh, may just be a name that's given to the king, but it may also be the name given to the king of a particular dynasty. And it says here, who ruled in Chatzor, in the past tense. In fact, if we're going to be very specific, the correct way of translating it would be who had ruled in Chatzor. Now, it's past perfect. It's something that's way back when. So it's very possible that this Yavin is not the same Yavin. Clearly is not the same Yavin that Joshua killed, because then he wouldn't be alive here. But that this is somebody who is from that family who has now gathered around himself the remnants of the Canaanite nations, and he is their king. And to be noted, it says here Yavin is the king of Canaan. It doesn't say he is the king of Chatzor, because Chatzor really is no longer. Then we have his general, his chief of staff, Sisera, who is in a place called Charoshet Hagoyim, which I guess if you would translate it literally, it means the plow of the nations. I'm not sure why it's called the plow of the nations. Maybe it was an area that was rich in wheat, but I do want to just note something very interesting. There was a very famous archaeologist here in Israel, passed away a few years ago. His name was Adam Zartal. He is the archaeologist who found the altar, Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal. And one of the other things that he discovered, he found the remnants of an ancient tell of an ancient site above the Jezreel Valley. And he believes that this was a Charoshet Hagoyim, that this was that very place that was Sisera's base. Now, my husband and I had the privilege just a few months ago to go to Sardinia. And that really, the Sardinia holds the key to understand who Sisera was and what was Haroshet Hagoyim, at least according to Adam Zartal. It's not a theory that's accepted by everyone, but it is certainly a fascinating theory. He found in this place, in this ancient site in Israel, he found very unusual structures. And the remnants of a town with unusual structures and unusual sorts of walls, and he had not seen anything similar to it anywhere in Israel or indeed in the Middle East. In the course of his research, he discovered that these structures are almost identical to a very unique structure that is in Sardinia. In Sardinia, there is a number of these unusual structures, and one of them, actually the best preserved one, we actually went to see, and it is just amazing. Right near that place where we saw it is actually a village in Sardinia called Sisera, or something very similar. Anyway, as a result of comparing these structures, pottery, and all kinds of things, Adam Zartal came to the conclusion that Sisera was actually part of a group of nations called the Shardona. Shardona he actually sees as being very similar in name to the word Sardinia. And they're part of the same nations that were the Philistines. In other words, these were people who were actually mercenaries. They were involved in many different battles in the ancient world, from Greece, southern Italy, and North Africa, and at some point actually were defeated and then retreated back to some of these areas like Sardinia and Israel. So we have evidence we know about the Philistines, of course, from the Bible. There are evidences of other nations that came in at the same time. These were different from the Canaanites. The Canaanites were actually native to the land and dwelled in the land for centuries. We know that the Canaanites were in the land back when Abraham enters the land. The Philistines are a later entry, and they are not here permanently. Most of the time they are along the coast, and the word Philistine itself means invaders. So these people, like the people that Sisera is from, the Shardone, they have all come in from the sea. They are mercenaries, and they're looking for opportunities. In the case of the Philistines, of course, we know throughout the book of Judges that they really cause a lot of problems to the Israelites until they are finally defeated in the book of Samuel by King David. Here, though, what we probably have in this situation is we have Yavin, who is a remnant of the Canaanites, who have decided, let's take one last stand on behalf of the Canaanites to drive the Israelites from the land, or at least defeat them in the area of the Galilee, teaming up with this fellow named Sisera, who is from somewhere else, but he's a mercenary, and so he is a soldier for hire with his own camp, his own soldiers, and they team up together in order to try to defeat the Israelites. So that's just a very interesting background to understand who these people are. All right, but let's go into the story itself. The story begins with Deborah coming to Barak and challenging him in God's name to go and fight against Yavin, who is already accumulating an army. And Barak himself is very hesitant to do this. He's worried, he's afraid. And Deborah makes this wonderful, wonderful statement. First of all, Barak says to her, and now Deborah, of course, is a prophetess, and she brings the word of God. Barak is a general. But he says to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you do not go with me, I will not go. So it's very interesting, because here we have the prophetess, the woman, going to the man, and certainly in ancient times, much more than today, a woman is certainly not supposed to be on the battlefield. And yet Barak clearly indicates that he is not comfortable, he doesn't feel confident going without Deborah coming with him. And her answer to him is really quite derogatory. She basically says, okay, I'll go with you. Don't worry, I'll go with you. And this is in verse 9. She says, but you should know that at the end of the day, the victory will not be for your glory. You will not be credited with this victory. And she says, because God will defeat Sisera by the hands of a woman. Now, it is clear that when she's saying this, she's referring to herself. That she's basically saying, Barak, you're too chicken to go without me. I'll go with you, but you should realize I'm going to get credit for this, okay? It'll be a woman. And a woman, of course, in this kind of context is quite shameful for a general. Then instead of him getting the credit, it's going to be the credit of a woman. But actually, as we know, at the end of the story, Deborah, of course, is a hero, and she sings a wonderful song, a poem after this wonderful defeat of this whole Canaanite army and Sisera, etc. But the woman who actually defeats Sisera is Yael, not Deborah. Actually, there's a bit of a hint, and this is one thing that I think, while Deborah is certainly a hero, I think she did have this small weakness. She had a touch of arrogance. And I think you see that here, and you see it as well in her song in verse 7. She's talking about all the trouble that the Israelites are facing with the persecution that they're experiencing from these different nations. She's going back, of course, all the way back to Shamgar, and continues forward. And then she says, until I arose, Deborah, I arose a mother in Israel. Also, a little bit of an arrogance there. But anyway, that's just a comment about Deborah. Anyway, let's move forward. As we know, the story continues. There's a great battle, and there's a wonderful victory. And we learn more about how that victory actually happened in Deborah's song, when we learn that the Kishon River actually floods at this amazing moment in time when the army of Sisera is in that riverbed. And let's talk about what a nachal is. It's not really a river. It is typically a dry riverbed that only fills in times of unusual rains, and sometimes when there's a lot of rain in the winter, and the rest of the time it will be dry. That is a very concept, very unique to Israel and other parts of the Middle East. You don't see that type of situation in Europe or in North America. But that's what a nachal is, and that's the word that's used here. It's a wadi in Arabic, a nachal, or a riverbed. So you're talking about a situation where the army is going into the Kishon riverbed when it's dry, when it's a place where people go all the time, not expecting that there would be this sudden rainfall, there'd be sudden gush of rain. So it must have been in the spring or even later, when the assumption would have been that the rains would have finished. So there wouldn't have been this kind of issue, but they were clearly surprised as God brings this miraculous storm, immediately floods the area, and that gets them stuck. Their chariots then are no longer of use, and it makes it much easier for Barak, who doesn't have that kind of manpower and chariots, to defeat them. And then we have Sisera, who is not quite the brave general in this story, because he runs from the battlefield and seeking shelter. And who does he seek shelter from? And here we have in verse 11, we have the introduction of somebody else, a whole new family. Hever, the Kenite, separated from Cain. The Kenite, it means they're from the family of Cain. It's the same name, okay? From the sons of Chovav, the father-in-law of Moses. And he pitched his tent at Alon in the Tzananim, which is near Kadesh. In other words, we have a family who's the Kenite family. They are of the family of Jethro, of Chovav, and we'll get to some of these names in a minute. Chovav, the father-in-law of Moses. And we know that this group of the family, this Hever group of the family, separates himself from the rest of the family and goes to live near Kadesh. Kadesh is in the Galilee, in that same area where the battle is taking place. Okay. Later on in the story, we see so basically where do we find this? 1 second. So later on in the story, we see in verse 17, as Sisera escapes from the battle, he goes to the tent of Yael, the wife of Hever, the Kenite. And here the scripture tells us, because there is peaceful relations between Yavin, the king of Hatzor, and between the house of Hever, the Kenite. All right, so now I want to stop for a second, and before we get to see what happens to Yael and her amazing character that we see in this story, let's have a little bit of an understanding. Who are these Kenites? Who is Hever? And what do we know about them? Simply by reading the Bible, okay? And this is one of the things I love to do. I think that studying the background of history and archaeology and all these things enrich our understanding of the Bible in many ways. But very often you can find keys to a story just by connecting the dots and finding all the other places in the Bible that give you some kind of background to a story that you're looking at now. So here we have a hint, we have a clue here in verse 11 that this family has to do with Chovav, the father-in-law of Moses. Now, who's the father-in-law of Moses? Actually, he appears in the Bible a few different places and with different names. Okay, so the first time we meet him is in Exodus chapter 2, verse 18, and that is where Moses has escaped from Egypt, and he comes to this well in Midian, and he meets these girls. Turns out they're the daughters of someone named Reuel, okay? And one of those daughters, Zipporah, then marries Moses. So Reuel is his father-in-law, okay? So in that first introduction to him, we meet him as Reuel. However, in chapter 3, he is referred to as Jethro. Also in chapter 18, when after the parting of the Red Sea, Jethro then brings his wife Zipporah and their children, who have stayed behind in Midian while Moses is doing his thing in Egypt. Now that the whole country, the whole nation has left Egypt and they're safely ensconced in the desert, Jethro brings the family to Moses, and he is called Jethro at that point, chapter 18. Now, in chapter 4 in Exodus, he has a different name called Yeter. Okay, Jether, I assume, Jether. So Jether and Jethro are really the same name. They're so similar, you don't even notice that there are two different names, but indeed they're written a little differently. Okay, now if we go to the book of Numbers in chapter 10, okay, here we meet Jethro again. Well, we think it's Jethro. We don't use the name Jethro in chapter 10. And this is at a point at which Moses thinks they're about to go into the land of Israel. This is before the sin of the spies. And they're getting ready to go. And we have in verse 29, Moses says to Chovav, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, the father-in-law of Moses, and starts to tell him, we're now about to go into the land of Israel. Why don't you join us? And he says, well, I think no. I think I'm going to go back to my country. And Moses says, no, we really need you. Stay with us. And we never do hear Chovav's answer. Now, there's a lot of conversation here as who is Chovav, because it says Chovav, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, the father-in-law of Moses. Is Chovav the father-in-law of Moses, in which case he's the same as Jethro, or is Reuel the father-in-law of Moses, and Chovav is his son, in which case Chovav would be Zipporah's brother. But we have no indication that there are any boys in that family, because initially we have all the girls taking the sheep to graze. If there were sons in that family, you would assume the sons would have been doing it and not the daughters. So again, we're not sure. We really don't know. Chovav could be the same as Jethro, but again, before we saw that Reuel is also Jethro. So whatever, it's the same family. Whether Reuel is the father-in-law or whether Chovav is the father-in-law, it's the same family, okay? And so here, Moses is telling them to go off, and we don't have the answer. We don't know what happens. So how do we find out what happens? So we have to keep moving further. Okay, in the book of Judges, the book we're in right now, okay, just before our story here, in chapter 1, we have a little verse that tells us a little something about who these people, about whatever happened to the Canaanites, this tribe of Canaanite, who is the father-in-law of Moses, because we have in chapter 1, book of Judges, chapter 1, verse 16, we have the following. And the sons of Canaan, the father-in-law of Moses, came up from the city of palms, which is Jericho, to be with the children of Judah in the desert, in the Judean desert. Okay, and he basically, you have this a little fact here, that these people, the family of the Kenites, which is the part of the family of the father-in-law of Moses, they come from Jericho and join Judah, dwelling with them somewhere in the Negev. Okay, what does that mean? That chances are when Moses says, come with us into the land, they do. And now, after the land has been conquered, we see they're here. They are separate. They are their own group of people. They're not part of the nation of Israel. They have their own tribal affiliation. They are sons of the Kenites, but they're connecting with the children, with the tribe of Judah, and they're dwelling in the Negev. Okay, now if we go back to our chapter verse 11, chapter 4, verse 11 in the book of Judges, we learn something else. We learn that Heber the Kenite separated from the rest of the tribe and moves to the north. So if we connect this with what we learned in chapter 1, we see that the Kenite group stayed in the Negev, but then part of them separated and went up to live in the Galilee. Now, there's one more little piece of information that we learn afterwards. In the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, chapter 15, okay, verse 6, this is the point at which Saul is already the king, and based on God's command, Saul is going to do battle against the Amalek. Now, Amalek, as you know, is a very evil nation. They were the first nation to attack the Israelites after the parting of the Red Sea, after the Exodus from Egypt. And God has a special commandment to the nation of Israel to destroy the nation of Amalek, because they, in rebelling against, in seeking battle against the nation of Israel, they have rebelled against God, and they have tried to attack Israel when they were at their most vulnerable. And therefore, God sees them as an enemy, not just of Israel, but an enemy of God. And this is a very specific commandment. Now, this commandment then is not fulfilled until Saul is told to do it, and this is one of the things he does. Now, right before he's about to wage this battle, he turns to the Kenites, the sons of Cain, the Kenite clan, that are sitting among the Amalek in the Negev, and he says, separate yourselves from the Amalek, because I'm about to go and do battle on the Amalek, and they do. They leave. So that completes our picture. What we know from the Kenites is that they started out in Jericho. They were with the nation of Israel. They then dwell in the Negev, in the area of Judah, but we know that it's Amalek, who is a very a bandit, marauding kind of tribe, living in the same area as Judah, in the Negev, and they go and live with them. So in other words, whereas they started at the beginning of Judges as being closer to Judah, at some point they end up being closer to Amalek. And it's about all the way in Saul's time. Saul's time is, quite some distance of time after Deborah, and they separate themselves from that. So it's very possible that, and again, this is conjecture, but it's very possible that at the point at which the Kenite tribe ends up aligning itself more closely with the Amalek, that this group of Kenites, the Hever group, decides, no, we don't want to be with the Amaleks, we're moving to the north, and they do. It's also possible that they move to the north just because they have better grazing opportunities or better weather or whatever, but this certainly is one possibility. But what we do learn about Hever and the Kenites up there in the north is that they like to get along with everybody. They get along with the Canaanites and they get along with the Israelites. They don't want to choose sides. Now, it's very interesting about them. I had a teacher once that gave a very interesting analysis of Jethro. Jethro, who is mentioned as a priest of the Midianites. There is a tradition in the Midrash, in our Jewish heritage, there's a tradition that says that Jethro himself was very interested in all religions. He was a pagan, and yet he was interested in everybody, and actually was very interested in Moses and the monotheism that he presented. And one of the reasons he comes to Moses and brings his wife and children, what is the first thing he says to him? He says, I heard all that the God of Israel has done for you. He is just overawed by it all. But instead of joining Israel in a just saying, okay, I want to be a part of your nation, he remains a part. There's something about Jethro that is interested in it all, and very much admires and honors the God of Israel, but he doesn't want to actually join up with Israel. He wants to stay apart and remain friends, or he wants to remain a Midianite, or whatever it is he wants to do. So we're seeing a very similar characteristic in Hever here, where he wants to keep peace both with Yavin and with Israel, he doesn't want to take sides. He wants to be Switzerland. Okay? He wants to be neutral. One of the most amazing things that we see in the story with what Yael does is that in her actions, Yael, in actually, why does Sisera come to her tent? Because he assumes that she will give him shelter, because her family, Hever, that whole family, has good relations with his side. Okay, he comes to her tent and essentially forces her to take a side. Actually, she probably sees it as forcing her. She could have remained neutral. She could have said, "Okay, I'll give you rest." And if Barak would have come up, she would say, "Well, he's here." And she didn't really. She could have remained neutral and not get anybody angry, really, or get everybody angry. But she makes a very different decision. She pretends to welcome him, but very clearly she wants to be on the side of the Israelites, and therefore she lures him into her tent, and she gets him drowsy with milk, and she has him in a very relaxed kind of situation. And when he is totally unawares, she takes the tent peg, drives him into his head, very gruesome, very bloody, I'm sure, and he is dead. Barak, who is chasing after Sisera, comes up to the tent, and, well, the job has already been done. She really could have found a way to just, keep him there, lure him there, so that when Barak came, he would have said, "Oh, he's in the tent, do your thing," or "I'm out of it, I'm not going to get involved, but he's there and you're there, and do whatever you want." In her action, Yael took a very definite stand. And what she does is break the family tradition. She's basically saying, no more wishy-washy. You can't be friends with the Canaanites and friends with Israel at the same time. You have to choose a side. And she does. And this, of course, is what puts her in this, Hall of Fame, shall we say, of biblical heroes, when she just becomes such a wonderful, wonderful character. And Deborah herself blesses her with such wonderful words in chapter 5, verse 24. She says, Yael is blessed from all women. The wife of Hever the Kenite is blessed as the women, from more than all women, she is blessed in the tent. So Deborah, number one, reminds us that she is the wife of Hever the Kenite. She broke neutrality. She broke the tradition, the family tradition of the family of Hever the Kenite. And on the other hand, she holds her up as a model for all women who can take inspiration from her courage and her stand. I have always found Yael to be a marvelous example of the relationship of the nations to Israel. We know today we have friends and all over the world. On the national level, on the diplomatic level, Israel has many, many, many allies. But most of those allies are unwilling to stand with Israel when it means standing against Israel's neighbors. They want to stand with Israel when it's convenient. But then if it means standing against Israel's neighbors, as Israel's neighbors are trying to do things against Israel, they're very hesitant to do that. We saw that when Iran was going full steam ahead on a nuclear plan. We had all these people who were allies of Israel, including the United States, who was clearly one of Israel's most powerful and most important allies, bending to the influence of Iran and signing that nuclear deal. And this, of course, was, in my opinion, a real mark of shame that these nations had. Thank God the United States has since revoked that agreement, and we're very happy to see that. And unfortunately, not all the nations have. And we still see nations who are selling to Iran. And that's just one example. I believe that, and when we talk about individuals, and I think one of the things that I always feel so grateful for is that God placed me, I think, in this organization. I would never have thought of it, never would have dreamed I would do it, but here I am, the head and founder of Christian Friends of Israeli Communities for so many years. And one of the most exciting things that I am finding is that I'm meeting every day men and women of the nations who are taking a stand and who are standing for Israel, even when their own nations and their own leaders are not being as clear and as forthcoming in their support of Israel. And I think to all of you out there, Yael is clearly a source of inspiration. Follow her lead, stand with Israel, even when it means breaking your own family's traditions. It is certainly the stuff that heroes and heroines are made of. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon. Be well.